It feels like every time you think you're starting to understand crypto, the rug gets pulled out from under you. And what we're looking at today, I mean, this could be a major earthquake for crypto in the US.
Oh, absolutely.
The SEC, the ones who are supposed to keep our markets fair and square, they're sending some pretty strong signals that they might be changing their entire playbook on how they regulate crypto companies.
Yeah, for sure. If you've been following all the back and forth on crypto regulation,
Yeah.
the SEC may be stepping back from this whole thing about forcing crypto companies to register as exchanges.
Right.
That's a huge deal. Like, it could really change how the U.S. decides to oversee, this whole digital asset space,
Yeah,
which is obviously changing so fast.
for sure. And to make sure we're all on the same page, we've been going deep into some analysis from Micallesian. They had a great breakdown of some recent comments by the SEC's acting chair, Mark Yeda. Now, I know some people listening might not be total experts on all the ins and outs of regulatory stuff, but really the SEC's main job is protecting investors, making sure the markets are fair, and keeping money flowing smoothly.
Right.
And since Yeda stepped in, we've started to see some hints that things might be changing.
It's super interesting to compare that to how things were looking just a little while ago. Under the last chairman, Gary Gensler, the SEC, was really coming down hard on crypto. Lots of enforcement actions, really trying to jam crypto into the same rules as traditional securities.
Yeah, definitely. And this whole debate about having to register as exchanges, that's not even a new thing. It goes back to 2020 when Jay Clayton was in charge. Originally, it was about updating the rules for these things called alternative trading systems, or ATSs.
Yes.
They're basically these marketplaces that don't fit the mold of your typical stock exchange. The initial proposal was to update the rules for platforms dealing mostly with traditional securities. But then, when Gensler took over, they expanded the scope. All of a sudden, it looked like a lot of crypto trading platforms, even if they weren't dealing with securities, would be pulled into these regulations. And, I mean, you can imagine the crypto industry was not exactly thrilled about that.
Yeah, I can imagine. There was a lot of pushback from the industry. And it looks like maybe, at least to some degree, the SEC was listening.
Hmm.
And here's another wrinkle. They've gone and created this whole new crypto task force, which to me, this signals that maybe they're shifting away from just like punishing everyone and moving towards a more, thoughtful approach, maybe even a little collaboration.
That's a good point. Okay, so for everyone listening, what we really want to figure out today is what all of this means. What could this potential shift mean for crypto in the US? Feels like we're at a real turning point, right?
Absolutely. And the first thing that jumps out, like you said, is this possibility that the SEC might completely drop this whole ATS registration thing. This isn't just some small tweak. It's like a total 180 from the we're going to punish you era we've gotten used to.
It's not even about changing the rules, really. It's like they're rethinking their whole philosophy about digital assets. For years, the crypto world has been saying, hey, these old rules don't work for this new technology. You're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly. And now it seems like they're finally starting to listen. The fact that Acting Chair Uyeda specifically mentioned all the negative feedback they got on the proposed rule, that's a pretty big sign that they might actually be open to hearing what the industry has to say, which hasn't always been the case,
Totally. And this isn't happening in isolation. If you look at some of the other stuff the SEC has been doing lately, dropping those lawsuits against Coinbase and Kraken, putting things on hold with Binance, it's starting to look like a pattern.
It's definitely not random. When you put it all together, backing away from this proposal, dropping these high-profile cases, it points to a shift away from what a lot of crypto people have called regulation by enforcement. Instead of just suing people to try and make the rules after the fact, it seems like they might actually be trying to lay down some clear guidelines up front.
And the fact that this all came out at the International Bankers Association conference, it's got to be strategic. Like, they know the whole world is watching how they handle crypto, and they want to send a message.
Yeah, it's like they're signaling to all the big financial players out there that things are changing.
Right. Okay, so point one. There's a good chance we're seeing a pretty major shift in regulation. But let's talk about this new crypto task force. This sounds totally different. Instead of going straight for the legal attack, they're actually forming a group to, I guess, work things out.
That's the vibe I'm getting, for sure. It's more collaborative. Instead of just assuming everyone's doing something wrong, they seem to be trying to really understand the tech and build rules that actually make sense for it.
And Hester Pierce, one of the SEC commissioners, she's heading this task force, right? And she's been known to be a bit more, let's say, open-minded about crypto than some of the others. What do you make of her appointment?
I mean, she's been pretty consistent. She's been saying for a while now that crypto needs clear rules that can keep up with the tech, but that also protect investors.
Hmm.
So her leading this task force suggests that they're at least open to finding a better way. The fact that they're focusing on building new frameworks instead of just punishing past actions. That's a big deal.
And the first thing on their to-do list is a series of roundtables, right? Starting with trying to nail down what actually makes a digital asset a security.
That's the million-dollar question, right? Whether a crypto or NFT or whatever is considered a security has been at the heart of so many of the SEC's lawsuits. So tackling this head-on in their first roundtable shows that they're willing to have that conversation and maybe give the industry some much-needed clarity.
Which also kind of explains why they've been putting some of those lawsuits on hold. It's like they're saying, hold on, let's figure out what we're dealing with before we keep suing everyone.
Yeah, exactly. The SEC said straight up that this task force's work could affect how they go about enforcement. So this pause gives everyone a little breathing room and shows that they're willing to adjust their strategy based on what they learned from these talks.
It feels like they're realizing that trying to shove this whole new technology into rules meant for traditional finance just wasn't working. These are different beasts, you know?
That's a really important point. This task force shows that even the SEC is starting to see that a one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't cut it for blockchain and crypto. Maybe moving towards rules that recognize how different this tech is could be a game changer. It could let these complex DeFi protocols operate more freely and maybe even bring in the big institutional money that's been hesitant because of all the regulatory uncertainty.
Okay, so we've got the potential pullback from aggressive enforcement, the new collaborative task force. But the analysis we've been looking at points to another big piece of this puzzle. The SEC hasn't exactly been winning every legal battle against crypto companies.
It's definitely playing a role. This shift isn't happening in a vacuum. The courts have been pushing back against the SEC's hardline approach.
Right. Under Gensler, the SEC's position was basically, most cryptos are securities, end of story. But trying to prove that in court has been way harder than they thought.
For sure. Judges have been getting tougher on the SEC, and they've struggled to convince them that they have the authority over all these different digital assets. It raises the question, if your arguments aren't winning in court, is your whole strategy even working?
Plus, we can't forget how this registration proposal even came about. It started as a way to update rules for government securities trading back in 2022, but then they just decided to lump crypto platforms in there, and that's when things got really messy.
Oh yeah, that expansion was controversial, to say the least. People were worried that the SEC was overreaching, trying to apply rules meant for traditional markets to something as new and different as crypto.
So when you step back and look at the whole picture, it doesn't seem like the SEC is just having a change of heart. It's more like they're being forced to reassess. Maybe the courts are pushing back, maybe they're realizing their old tactics aren't working.
I think that's spot on. It's not just about ideology. It's about real-world results.
Okay, let's sum things up for our listeners. It really does look like the SEC is changing its tune on crypto regulation in the US. They might be backing away from all the lawsuits and rethinking these registration requirements for exchanges. This new crypto task force suggests they're willing to work with the industry, and it's pretty clear that the legal challenges they've faced are having an impact.
Exactly. And for anyone listening who's trying to keep up with all this, paying attention to these signals is key. What the SEC does next could have huge consequences for crypto in the US, and probably for the rest of the world too. Other countries and big financial institutions are watching closely.
Here's a final thought to leave you with. What if the US actually does build a regulatory framework specifically designed for crypto? What doors could that open for innovation? How much could adoption grow? But even with these potential changes, what are the big challenges that crypto still needs to overcome? What kind of clarity do they need to really thrive in the long run? We're definitely entering a new chapter, and there are a lot of big questions still hanging in the balance.
A lot to think about for sure.
Thanks for breaking it all down with me.
Happy to. Always an interesting conversation.